So I'm going to talk to you today about consent and capacity issues, which is always really fascinating to do for a national audience. There's going to be lots of slides, lots of resources, and I apologize for having to go relatively quickly, more quickly than I'd like to, but you will have the slides and resources to look at later on. I basically want to try to cover the basics, but I'm aware of the fact that things are so different across the country, and I hope to learn a little bit from you as well. And let's get started. So as was mentioned, I do receive consulting fees from the Capacity Assessment Office, which is a unique office in Ontario, but I'm not actually a capacity assessor. And this program hasn't received any funding other than what's mentioned. And I'm going to basically be talking a little bit about issues, but not specifically about anything related to the Capacity Assessment Office. So what I wanted to try to cover today was the concept of decision-making capacity, broadly speaking, not necessarily just for people with dementia, but broadly speaking. Talk to you a little bit about how I approach or think about assessing decision-making capacity, and then to highlight what you already know, that the consent and capacity laws are going to be very, very different across the country, and those are going to determine how you use them and in what way you're involved. And because I work with so many lawyers, I wanted to point out that I'm not going to be providing legal advice. I'd also like to say that I don't do MAID assessments, and I'm not going to be talking about that specifically as well. So this is a definition that I like to use. That's from a colleague of ours in Alberta. It's a broad definition, but it's one that highlights the fact that capacity is a cognitive process, and that's really interesting to think about. Understanding and identifying options, appreciating the consequences of options, and following through with those options. So that's a nice way of thinking about it. I apologize for the overhead announcements. The other thing to think about is the fact that a person is presumed capable unless there's evidence to override that presumption. So when you're doing your assessments or thinking about individuals, you want to be thinking a little bit like a lawyer. What evidence is there to override that presumption of capacity? As you can imagine, there are particular groups of patients or clients that we see are going to be most likely to be ones where we question capacity, and those are going to be these groups: people with intellectual disabilities, psychiatric disorders, neurodegenerative disorders, and acquired neurological disorders, which might be acquired brain injuries and other kinds of neurological disorders. So as you probably are well aware, capacity is task specific. So when someone says, is someone capable, the first question I'm always asking is, capable of what? Is it managing their finances? Is it making personal care decisions? What are we talking about? It's situation and context specific, which is so interesting. Is it just a simple financial situation? Pension check in, rent check out, or is it much more complicated with multiple properties and investments? And it's very much jurisdiction specific. So if you're reading journals, you have to think about where was that article written, what's going on, what's the law. The law is different in every single province and territory in this country and every single state in the United States. So what capacity is not, which is very, very important to think about, it's not lack of education about a decision. So as sometimes comes up, someone has been managing the finances, they die, their spouse is now thrust into that job and has never been educated about the financial situation. It would definitely not be fair to approach them and want to be assessing their capacity to manage property without educating them about what's in the bank and what's going on. Just like approaching someone to try to determine if they're capable of consenting to treatment without educating them about the treatment would not be appropriate. It's definitely not the score in cognitive testing. It's definitely not agreement with us. It's not determined by a diagnosis. You can have a variety of diagnoses and still be very much capable. It's not determined by low risk behavior. People don't do things that upset us. It doesn't mean they're capable. And it's not determined by wishes. So often people have incredible wishes, but they're sometimes not appropriate and don't necessarily relate to things that are capable wishes. So I'd like to highlight the difference between a clinical assessment and assessment of capacity, decision-making capacity. When we're doing a clinical assessment, we're thinking about diagnosis and treatment. We're thinking about trying to solve somebody's problems, trying to do the best for them to make them thrive. We might be doing a mental status, we might be doing cognitive screening, and we might be doing a functional assessment, or someone else might be doing that with us. But in a capacity assessment, it's a capacity determination. So it's a very different thing. It's a black or white, capable or not. Sometimes that's the challenge. You can't be sort of partly capable. You're either capable or not with respect to a particular decision. We might be determining if someone's rights are going to be removed. We want to be asking questions regarding that decisional capacity. And the assessment may have specific legal requirements, documents, places you have to fill things out, protocols that you have to use. So the first question I'm always asking is, how will an assessment of capacity help? I'm always lining my ducks up in a row, because often people want to know, is someone capable? And they think that if they decide whether they're capable or not, that will somehow determine what happens. And I'm always trying to understand, especially depending on your jurisdiction, what that assessment of capacity is going to allow you to do or not do, or what it's going to determine in terms of next steps. So I wondered if folks would be comfortable, and even Ian, if you could share with me, because I can't necessarily see all that's in the chat box, about tools or protocols that you use across the country. This is my chance to learn from you when you're assessing capacity in your practice, or as part of a legally mandated assessment in your province or territory. Are there any go-to tools that you folks use that you found helpful? Things that you use? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so just go, I was just going to say, just go ahead. If people can put that in the chat, and then I'll let Dr. Cohen know.
That would be great, just to sort of get a sense of what you're using or not using. Maybe you're using nothing. Maybe I'll learn something. Maybe there's nothing there, but I just thought I'd give you a chance.
So Nicole Lamkin is saying the MMSE and the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, and Marcia Curtis, the SMMSE and the MOCA.
Okay, so a lot of cognitive testing, which is going to get you only very much a mini step into deciding whether someone's capable. Anything else?
Not yet. There we go. Same here for us in Newfoundland from Benet. She's saying MMSE and MOCA as well.
Okay, well, let's go on. That's really, really interesting. All right. So let me tell you how I think about this broadly speaking, and this is not as someone who's talking as a capacity assessor in any way from the province of Ontario. This is just taking a big step back and trying to think about assessing decisional capacity, what might be the steps that you would want to go through. So the first thing you got to figure out is what domain. Is it finances? Is it property? Is it personal care? Is it some sort of treatment decision? What is it that the domain is? And why an assessment is needed. As I said, I always want to think about why. What's it going to do for me? How's it going to help? Other options, less restrictive options, are always more important, and the first thing you should be thinking about. It's quite intrusive to be doing these kinds of assessments, and there's actually been court judgments in Ontario where judges said, whoa, let's stop with the conflicting, dueling capacity assessments, and let's just back off this poor 89-year-old lady and let her have a rest, because it can be quite intrusive. Who should be doing the assessment? In some jurisdictions, there are people who are mandated or not mandated, and other specific legal requirements, as I mentioned. You want to be thinking about what information do you have from others. So it's always nice, if you can, to get information from others about the situation, the context, the risk. That's what always makes everyone nervous. What the options are, say the treatment options, or options for staying at home, moving. What are the demands for this situation or decision? Is someone just got a very simple financial situation, or do they have a complicated one? Is it very simple treatment, or is it a very complicated treatment plan that we're talking about? So what kind of demands are there? What does that person need to be able to do to live at home independently? And any information you might be able to glean about their cognition, scores on the MMSE and MOCA is a little fraction that might help you understand that it gives you a little bit of light, some functioning. What are they able to do or not able to do? And what's been tried and the outcome. So that's always helpful, right? What has been tried to keep Mrs. Smith at home safely? Well, they sent over someone from home care to give her a bath, but she turned them away all the time. Or we've tried direct deposit, direct withdrawal, and it's not working for whatever reasons. You want to be involving and educating your client so that what's the proposed treatment? What are their current financial situation? What are their home care options, so that you know they've been educated or that someone else has educated them? And what are the options? The status quo, these could be the consequences. Potential solutions, these could be the consequences. So they have some understanding of what the lay of the land is. You want to think about optimizing their functioning during the assessment. So that's really important, to be thinking about accommodations and how to optimize. You want to pay attention to their hearing, to their language abilities, to the time of the day. You don't want to find someone capable because they didn't understand you, they couldn't hear you, you didn't use a translator, or they've just taken their opioids and they're having a little snooze after lunch, and that's the worst time to catch them alert and able to engage with you. You want to be thinking about considerations such as which vulnerable group is this person coming from. So it's going to be very different thinking about capacity for someone who has an intellectual disability and never learned, for instance, numeracy skills, or never learned how to manage their money and is not able to, versus someone with a dementia or neurocognitive disorder who did know very much how to manage their money but has lost that ability. You want to think about where their strengths might be in terms of cognitive functioning and functional abilities. But again, just because someone can't get to the bank doesn't mean they're incapable of managing their property. What you want to be thinking about is, okay, they can't get to the bank themselves, but what other arrangements could they be making? So that's getting into the cognitive domain. You want to be thinking about their past preferences and values, and how does that correlate with their current decisions? So you can have some questions for them about, wow, you always used to be so cautious about your finances. What's going on now? Why the change? You want to know when to consult. For communication difficulties, for instance, I would always be consulting to try to get a speech language pathologist to help me communicate with someone. You want to be having a lawyer or a group of lawyers on speed dial if possible to ask them legal questions. Help with specific populations. For me, for instance, intellectual disability is not something I work with a lot in my practice, so I probably want some help from somebody. And experts in your region. It's always nice to have a few people that you can turn to. After you've done all that, you still need to try to ask some questions to determine whether someone's capable. And these are the Applebaum criteria that you may have heard of. And they're, again, another way of thinking about it. I gave you a broad definition on the first couple of slides. Here's another way of thinking about it. Does that person understand information relevant to them and their decision? They appreciate the relevance to them of the particular situation? And can they think about comparative and consequential kind of decision making? We'll talk more about that. And can they rationally manipulate the information you're giving them to give you a reasoned choice and a reasoned decision? And can they express a consistent choice? So these are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about when you're fashioning your questions. So it's really important to know the laws and procedures in your jurisdiction. Usually the broad definition is ability to understand information relevant to making a decision, and ability to appreciate the consequences of a decision or a lack of decision. So that's the challenge, is to think about those definitions, the person in front of you, the situation, and to fashion a series of questions to ask them about it. So the gold standard really still is a clinical interview. There are research criteria, protocols that you could use, but really it's just talking to someone. And what you want to be doing is talking and asking and listening. A lot of probing and verifying, probing and verifying. Can you tell me more about why you want to do this or don't want to do that? Can you help me understand what you're thinking? So really your job is what's in that little box, which is decision specific, finances, personal care, treatment, probing of insight and reasoning, using specific examples from that person's situation. So a lot of asking and listening, and risk is going to be factored into that questioning. So if it's a low risk decision, it'll be different. If it's a high risk decision, then you're going to be asking a lot more questions and be probing a lot more. So you want to be thinking about insight. Do they appreciate the problem affects them? If someone doesn't realize they have diabetes and can't understand they have diabetes, that's very difficult for them to be capable of consenting to treatment for diabetes. Similarly, for some mental health disorders. Consequential reasoning. Can they tell you how one choice will affect their life and what the outcome would be if they made that decision? And then can they compare that to another decision? And can they give you some ideas of what the pros and cons are of one outcome versus another? So again, getting them to think not only about, do they understand the treatment, but can they tell you more about appreciating the consequences of the treatment or the consequences of their decisions? So you want to document. It's really, really important to document, because a week from now, a month from now, 2 years from now, when someone comes to you and says, oh, you had a discussion with Mrs. Smith about this. Well, how did it go? Of course, it's hard to remember. So you want to be noting your start time and end time. The lawyers always like to know, how much time did you spend with that individual to come to this very important decision? Direct quotes are amazing and really, really helpful. There's nothing like a direct quote to make your day and to make the reader's day and say, oh, definitely that sounds like someone who's capable or incapable. If possible, it's always nice to be able to link your finding inability to understand and appreciate to the diagnosis. They can't understand and appreciate because of short-term memory problems related to their neurocognitive disorder, or they lack the ability to appreciate because of executive dysfunction in the context of a traumatic brain injury. So you want to try to think about that, and you want to, by thinking about the impairment and the decision-making, to actual predictable problems in their life, that they're not paying their rent, therefore they're probably going to get evicted, and there's some consequences of that. You want to be using the relevant language from the legislation, and you want to be providing the reader enough evidence to override the presumption of capacity. So that's an awful lot I've covered, and I apologize. Hopefully you'll have time to go back and look over some of these slides. Let's go to very specific areas now, just some specific areas to give you some more tools. If you're thinking about treatment, the Aid to Capacity Evaluation is a helpful tool developed by colleagues of mine in Ontario, and it gives you sort of a series of types of questions to ask that might be helpful for individuals who you're trying to decide whether they're capable of consenting to treatment or not. Managing finances, different legislation in different provinces in terms of what you can and can't do. Very different on Ontario than other provinces in terms of who assesses. So I've given you some reviews here, a review of the different measures of financial capacity, which looks at some research measures. I've talked a little bit about in this slide from Wadira about what is the role of a clinician with respect to finances. And these might be some of the things you might be doing, educating families, thinking about, ooh, I think that person's having trouble. Maybe doing some assessments in certain circumstances related to that, practical interventions to help them set up direct deposit withdrawal, and then making legal or medical legal referrals to capacity assessors in my province or other individuals in other provinces. Capacity to live independently is the billion-dollar question. I get asked a lot because I do a lot of outreach. It's not easily assessed in an office setting. It's not determined by functional status or dependence. People can be incredibly dependent on others, but still have the cognitive abilities to know what their options are and their choices. You need a lot of collateral information, and your capacity determination may not solve the problem. Just because I decide Mrs. Smith isn't capable of consenting to that lady coming and giving her a bath doesn't necessarily solve the problem of how to get that lady into the home and how to get her into the bathtub. It's often not a black or white situation. You want to be exploring these different domains when you're thinking about personal care. And I've given you another reference there, which helps unpack this a bit. And then you want to be probing insight and reasoning with respect to their decision-making versus their objective functional abilities. So this person can't cook because you have objective information that they burn down the house almost every time they try to cook. So what is that conversation going to be with them about? What are you doing about preparing food? I'm cooking. Well, I heard there were problems. No, there's never been problems. Well, and going back and forth to try to unpack that, to try to have a conversation about whether they recognize the problems, whether they can problem solve around them. So what's that gap between the demands they have and their abilities? The best question I can't take credit for. It came from a lawyer that I've worked with over the years. And the best probing question is, how will you know it's time to get help or move? Sitting in someone's house, ask them that question. I can tell you, my daughter, I trust her completely. When she says it's time to get help or move, then I know that's it. And I turn to that person and say, well, as a matter of fact, the reason I'm sitting here is because your daughter's very worried about you and she thinks you do need some help or you do need to move. Well, what does she know anyway? She's just a busybody. She only interferes in my life. Change the subject, talk about something else, come back and get that same line of reasoning. You know there's a problem there with the reasoning. Trust that person, but can't hear or understand or appreciate that there's a problem despite the trusted person telling them. And here's another reference that might be helpful for you. Other issues that come up, which we may want to talk about, fluctuating capacity. This often comes up in the context of substance abuse, psychiatric disorders, delirium. I've tried to give you a few references that might unpack this a little bit more. It's a very complicated area. There's no easy answers. The laws weren't really written in most jurisdictions to deal with these problems. And then there's the role of healthcare providers versus others. So the lawyers, the banking system, home care, risk issues, those are all things that come up that are really problematic that we may want to talk about a little bit more. Other resources that you might find helpful. One of my colleagues provides amazing resources through her website, and Kim Whaley is a lawyer who runs a firm called Whaley and Associates, and she's got a sort of cross Canada chart that gives you this sort of legislation in all the different jurisdictions. There's this ABA APA handbook, which I know is out of the States, but because the Americans have different legislation in different jurisdictions, it's a very broad overview of how to think about capacity evaluations assessments, and that's the American Bar Association, the American Psychological Association handbook. Great bedtime reading. And if you're interested, as I say, I'm not a capacity assessor, but if you want to see the guidelines that capacity assessors use in Ontario, not the be all and end all, but it is one attempt to provide guidelines, then these are some of the guidelines that you can reference. So I'll stop sharing there. It's an awful lot of information, and I apologize, but I've tried to hopefully give you a lot of references and a lot of ideas. I appreciate that many of you have mentioned cognitive screening tests, and those are just the beginning of the conversation. They might direct you, but you still need to have a lot more fulsome discussion with people before you decide whether they're capable or not of a particular decision. Lauren, is it okay if I ask Lauren to unmute and ask a question?
Absolutely.
Ian? Okay, Lauren, take it away.
Hi, Carole. Thank you so much. I super appreciate this information because it's so very tricky. The one area that I struggle, and I don't know, maybe you can answer this because it's Canadian wide, is the CRA. So
in what way?
Well, so we have a regional capacity assessment team here in Calgary, Alberta, and I love them. And they'll break down capacity into those different domains, right? Social activities, health-related decisions, et cetera, et cetera. The CRA just doesn't like anything. And so we have a form here that has like a supported decision-making tool that will allow people to name an individual to help them make their decision. It's not fully, declaring them to lack capacity and enacting a PD. It's sort of like a hand-holding one. But again, it doesn't cover finances, and it seems like the CRA will just accept nothing except for like a full EPOA being enacted. And
let me unpack a few of these acronyms to make sure I understand them all. By CRA, you mean
like Canadian Revenue Agency.
Okay.
So sorry,
just wanted to check we were on the same page and there wasn't some other CRA with Calgary in it that I didn't know about.
Sorry. Yeah. Yes.
No, that's good. That's just it's part of the challenge across Canada. So what you're saying is, if someone's not capable of managing their property and you think they need help, you would like the CRA to allow this person to help them, and they don't recognize your things.
So if the EPOA, like the enduring power of attorney, is not like enacted and the physician or whomever hasn't declared them to lack that capacity, the CRA just won't accept it. Whereas I think it's a fine line. Like, taxes are complex, and if you've never done it, it doesn't mean that you should lack capacity in financial decisions. It maybe means you just need support. And I just didn't know if anybody else or yourself knew of a way to do that, because the only thing I've noticed is the Canadian Revenue Agency, and I get it's a protective thing, it's a safety thing too, but it's a very hard line. And a lot of my patients and their families have struggled completing taxes.
Well, I'm going to need some help on this, and I certainly would appreciate what I thought you were going to bring up. And this is the CBA issue, which is the Canadian Bar Association versus the Canadian Banking Association. So in my practice, the big issue is you go to the bank with that power of attorney and it hasn't been enacted yet in a particular way, and the bank says they want something or other. So again, this is the problem with powers of attorney. Unless you state otherwise in them, they become active the minute you sign them. If you have a delayed effectiveness clause or some sort of trigger in them, then sometimes it says it will only happen when my doctor declares or so-and-so declares. I can't speak to how that's used in Alberta. Here, that becomes a big trick because you go to the bank, there's no trigger in it, no delayed effectiveness clause, and the bank says, oh, I'm so worried, I don't know what to do. Can you give me an opinion that Mrs. is incapable? And so it's the same problem. And so we end up dancing around trying to figure out what to do about that. I would love a lawyer to help us with that. The lawyers don't have any answer with respect to my CBA problem, other than we have to kind of try to find a mediated solution. I have never encountered that because in Ontario, it's black or white. You're either managing or you're not managing. I would welcome to hear from people who have these supported decision-making in between areas, whether they have any ideas for your CRA problem. Was there anything in the chat, Ian, to help Lauren with the CRA conundrum? This is the first time it's coming up for me, Lauren, so I'm really interested in hearing that.
Other than sympathizing and saying that the CRA is frustrating. Not a lot, no.
No, so I will ask some lawyers and see if I can get answers. Sometimes they don't answer me that quickly, but this is the first time. I know my colleagues often are trying to get on the phone with their clients to talk to the CRA, but that doesn't answer your question.
Well, and they won't let us. Like, I've done it before too. And then if they think the patients are being guided, and I get it, I totally get it, they'll discontinue the call.
Yeah. No, so, I'll reach out to some lawyers and see if they have any ideas, but I think it's one of those black or white things where the law is really not helpful when it comes to particular organizations like the CRA or the banks, because the bank, this comes up all the time. But I'm really interested to hear that, and I'll make some inquiries and see if I can get you an answer.
I appreciate it. Even knowing that I'm not missing something and that it is the struggle for Malta is helpful. So
I don't think you're missing anything, but I'll reach out. Any other questions, Ian? Maybe you want to
Yeah, well, Mercy Serchuk had a comment there that she thought that you had to do a functional assessment as part of a capacity assessment.
Again, it's really interesting. It depends on the region and the province you're in and the territory you're in. In some provinces and territories, in Ontario, you don't have to do a functional assessment at all. So the functional assessment would be factored into what a capacity assessor or someone else is thinking about. Can that person do X, Y, or Z? How am I using that in that conversation I'm having? In some provinces, yes, there is a particular functional assessment that becomes attached to. So it's very different in different jurisdictions, and that's why it's so challenging. I believe a couple of provinces, you do a functional assessment that becomes part of the paperwork. In Ontario, a functional assessment alone is not going to get you anywhere. It's going to be paperwork that would take that into account. It's going to be much more the cognitive. Are they able to understand and appreciate related to their own functional abilities or inabilities?
Okay, thank you. Cindy Leclerc, did you want to comment? You mentioned something about the public trustees there. If you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean on that, when we have new admissions and they come from another hospital in Winnipeg, let's say, we're asking for information on how their capabilities are. Can they make their own decisions? And why are they public trustees? So we don't get a lot of information from our public trustees that are in place already before our new residents come into our facility. So we don't have a lot. We have to almost learn while they're admitted. And while they're here, if our physician feels like we can get more information from a psychiatry consult, then she will make a referral. And if they have no family support in place, like this one that just came to us, we have nothing to go by. Sometimes we do use the MOCA, but this lady got very upset when we tried the MOCA. And she said, do you think I'm a kid or something? Do you think I'm stupid? So I can understand when you were talking about that MOCA offends some.
Yeah. So Cindy, can I just back up a bit? Where do you work when you say facility?
Oh, a long-term care.
Long-term care home. And when you say the PGT's involved, are they involved as decision maker for, again, I'm only talking from my experience in Ontario, and it might be completely different in Manitoba. Here, the public guardian trustee might be involved because they're statutory guardian for property. So someone would have done something and that's locked in, like that's standing. So you don't need to do an assessment because that's it.
Right.
Sometimes in Ontario, they make treatment decisions only if the person's incapable of consenting to treatment. If there's no one else in Ontario, I apologize for coming back to Ontario. In Ontario, if there's no one else available on that ready-made list of decision makers, guardian, power of attorney for personal care, spouse, family member, then the public guardian trustee would make treatment decisions only if the person's incapable.
Okay.
And so that covers finances, that covers treatment. Then the personal care stuff, again, in Ontario, legislation covers that. And I don't know the legislation in Manitoba. So What is it that you're wondering about when that person comes to you that you're asking MOCAs and psychiatry input? What do you want to know?
The resident asked us if she could take over her own care.
Okay.
And more or less, there's no one in family support that can support that decision. So when we asked our public trustee, she just couldn't add anything more to that. It's just that she cannot take over her own finances because she would, not do it properly.
So I think, and again, I apologize, we're probably not going to have time to go through this whole scenario in detail, but it sounds like the person's been found incapable, the public garden trustees acting and managing their finances, but your client, your resident, isn't happy about that.
Right. That's
so now I got a different issue. That's still a clinical issue.
It
right?
is.
And it happens in every jurisdiction where someone's not happy. In Ontario, again, I apologize. In Ontario, if someone's not happy with that, they can work to get someone hired to do a reassessment.
That's right.
And their client rep at the PGT would have to help them do that. And there's a whole process which I can't speak to in Manitoba, but in Ontario, there are certain people who every 6 months ask to be reassessed, and every assessor in the region knows them because every 6 months they ask to be reassessed. And guess what the finding is? Every 6 months, they're incapable.
They're incapable.
So the money is spent every 6 months because they have the right to spend their money on that. Yeah. So again, it becomes a clinical issue, and you're going to have to use your colleagues here to figure out how to help someone accept or that's the case, or figure out what the process is for her to be reassessed. But there's only so many times you can do that without still having to face the music, which is someone doesn't have insight and understand how you're going to help them understand.
That's right.
People here don't like it because they have to go down and their budget's limited and they don't get the money they want. And so all of those things are still issues. Yeah,
exactly.
So I'm seeing here, if you want to have the PGT remove, the MD fills in a form with supporting evidence. So the MD would have to be okay with that and being comfortable saying the person's capable. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, here's another one. My husband works on his mother's taxes to send a consent form for her and me. Lauren, there's an answer from Vicky. Okay. Anything else, Ian? We're getting into the weeds.
Yeah.
Lots of interesting ideas and questions here.
Yeah, I'll just get maybe Kristen L. will maybe ask the final question before we change over to the presentation, case presentation. But Kristen L., did you want to ask your question?
Sure. So I've noticed a little bit of a trend. I work in a long-term care setting in Ontario, and I've noticed a bit of a trend where a lot of our clinicians and healthcare team are actually looking at the MMSE scores and the MOCA scores as a determination of capacity. So I just wanted to know how you would approach that, because I've brought it up several times, even just today before coming to here, because the nurse said, there was, I won't get into the entire situation, but she said, well, the MMSE score is this. And I said, well, so I just wanted to know how to really be heard that is not a determination for capacity for the residents.
But Kristen, thank God for you. God bless you. That's so amazing that you're standing up and saying that, because it's definitely not. I don't know how to get the message across in any way other than to pull out the legislation and quote them the fact that the legislation is very clear, Section 6 of the Substitute Decisions Act. And I didn't bring my book over because it relates only to Ontario, but I have the Ontario legislation in a book form that I turn to all the time. But that's Section 6 of the Substitute Decisions Act, and the Mental Health Act in Ontario uses the same definition: ability to understand information necessary to make a decision, ability to appreciate the consequences of the decision. And the only way to determine that is to talk to somebody and decide. An MMSE MOCA might help you. I mean, if someone's MOCA is 2, then you think there's a problem here. Either they can't communicate, and if you can't communicate, you may be incapable because you need to be able to communicate. So there may be an issue, but sometimes there are people who have a MOCA of 15 who can still be capable of lots of things. So God bless you. Quote the law, and I look at the Public Guardian Trustee website and see if you can find any helpful brochures or other things to download.
Okay.
And the other thing, you can always call the capacity assessment office and see if they have any other ideas for you.
Okay, I
Yeah.
really appreciate that. I just want to make sure I was on the right page, and I
You
thank
are,
you for
you
that.
are, and that's why I say it all the time. It is not an MMSE. I know people use it. It might shine it light in the right direction, but it's only shining the light. You still have to go down that darkened tunnel and do the scary thing, which is have that conversation, which is not an easy conversation. It's a very difficult conversation to have. If you think doing the MMSE and MOCA is hard, Cindy, try doing a capacity determination. It's a hard conversation to have for people.
Great, thank you very much. A couple of other comments. A couple of people just mentioned the fact that they've been able to get sort of third parties authorized to do taxes and ask questions about taxes and that sort of thing. Someone who goes to H&R Block and they have to sign a form so that an accountant can process their taxes for them. So that looking into that may be helpful in allowing others to assist in completion of those financial matters. So thank you, Dr. Cohen, very much. And now we're going to move on to the case presentation. And today, Jamie Boyd is going to give our presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to Jamie.
Hi, everyone.